Being a sea power, the secret of the Royal Navy's success is the fact that the TARs are all exceptionally trained, disciplined, and absolutely mental. But our island position and focus on ruling the waves has meant that the British Army has never been the biggest. With fewer bodies to gum up the meat grinder, we've maintained our position by doing a lot more with a lot less. After all, look at the legendary performance at Rorke's Drift or the exploits of the Paras and the SAS of today. We have some of the best fighters in the world, and even off the battlefield, Old Blighty has a solid tradition of pugilists and hulking bruisers. Because God knows that we need someone to keep us all in check after a few pints. However, for all of our martial prowess, the truth is that there is one regiment that absolutely mogs us at every turn. It turns out that the best fighters in the British Army are actually a bunch of unassuming, chipper little guys. And they're not even British. The Gurkhas. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Today's sponsor is me, because we don't have many sponsors this month because the economy is in the toilet. Thank you, Biden. But anyway, this is where I take the opportunity to just shout out my own stuff because I definitely don't do that enough. So if any of you want to go over and subscribe to my second channel, where I usually do about 2 uploads a day, usually talking about news and politics and mostly free speech centered subjects. And also, if all of you want to subscribe to the Patreon, because there's actual perks on there now. I'm sure you've seen by now, you get your name listed at the end of the video. Also, we have some chat rooms and stuff like that where I give some insider information on upcoming videos, and there's just all kinds of perks now. So, if you want to go on to the Patreon or the Subscribe Star where you get the exact same perks, that would be smashing, that would be wonderful. So, if you could all go and subscribe to the second channel, if you could all go and tell your friends about this channel, because YouTube does not share me in the algorithm at all. And also, if you could just sign up to the Patreon, sign up to the Subscribe Star, get yourself some nice little perks, get your name listed at the end of videos so that you can be rendered permanently unemployable forever and probably monitored by MI5, that would be lovely, that would be fantastic, and it helps me continue to do this work that I love so much and I think some of you love so much. Most of you. Some of you. But anyway, go do those things. I'll love you forever. I'll give you a great big kiss on your forehead, and I hope you and your family have a very Merry Christmas. Up in the Himalayas was the Gurkha kingdom, where the people traced their roots all the way back to an 8th century Hindu warrior named Guru Gorakhnath, after whom his people, the Gurkhas, were named. In 1767, the last Gurkha king, Prithvi Narayan Shah, went on the warpath, expanding his empire through the west of the Kathmandu Valley. You know, the standard 4 times gameplay loop. However, he pulled this off despite being heavily outnumbered, somehow managing to punch way above their weight and successfully invading many other principalities in the Himalayan foothills. Now, this may sound like an incredible feat, but these guys were, and still are, literally built different. Living up in the high altitudes of the Himalayas gets one used to existing in environments where the air is very thin on a day-to-day basis, which is conducive to practically superhuman cardio. And in addition to that, mountain life is a very, very rough existence that makes one very, very hardy and very, very good at fighting. In many ways, the Gurkhas were, and still are, a lot like mountain Fremen. I just thought I would let all of yous know, in case you were wondering why I'm not moving my hands as much and I'm sitting a lot more still than I usually do in all of my videos, it's because I've threw my shoulder out. Because I've been lifting so much iron at the gym. No big deal. I mean, apparently it is no big deal because I've threw my fucking shoulder out. In 1768, the Gurkhas expansionist war culminated in the Battle of Kathmandu against the King of Kantapur and the British East India Company, who sent an expedition of 2,500 men from Bengal to help prevent the Shah from getting a little bit too big for his boots. They got relentlessly ambushed and fewer than 1,000 men returned. But eventually, Shah made it to Kathmandu, united Nepal under a charmingly scuffed flag that went through a few reiterations over the years, and ruled it as its first king. All through the strength of men who were built different, amongst an entire civilization of people who are also built different. However, you wouldn't necessarily know that just from looking at them. With an average height of 5'3", many Gurkhas would actually fail to get into the regular British Army because they don't meet the height requirements. Hey, I wouldn't be surprised if their diminutive stature actually makes them harder to hit when they're running head-on into machine gun fire, which is something that they for some reason just fucking love doing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Despite what the author of Horrible Histories would tell you, machine guns hadn't been invented yet when we first met these hardy hill folk. So, we'll put a pin in that for now. It wasn't until 1814 that the East India Company encountered these mental mountain men once again. And since they were busy expanding outwards from the subcontinent, they immediately picked a fight with them, kicking off the Anglo-Nepalese War. 14,000 Gurkhas faced off against 50,000 men, and the British needed every single fucking one of those men because the Gurkhas used the terrain and their home field advantage to devastating effect. According to a soldier's memoirs, I never saw more steadfastness or bravery exhibited in my life. Run they would not, and of death they seemed to have no fear, though their comrades were falling thick around them. The Gurkhas were also described as a martial race who were described by British officials as naturally warlike and aggressive in battle. Judging by this praise, it's very obvious that the British gained an insane amount of respect for the Gurkhas, but not just for their martial prowess. They were also very touched by their conduct. According to James Fraser, a travel writer who accompanied a division on a trip, there was here no cruelty to wounded or to prisoners. No poisoned arrows were used, no wells or waters were poisoned, no rancorous spirit of revenge seemed to animate them. They fought us in fair conflict like men, and in intervals of actual combat showed us a liberal courtesy worthy of a more enlightened people. So, they fought hard, but they also fought fair. Despite the excellent showing by the Gurkhas, the British had an overwhelming resource and manpower advantage, basically winning by attrition. However, they couldn't outright take Nepal. Instead, they quit while they were ahead and they made peace with the 1816 Treaty of Sugauli, which netted them a lot of territory and secured a British presence in the capital of Kathmandu. In return, Nepal stayed independent with the borders that it maintains to this day. But more importantly, in the ultimate case of real recognising real, the British started recruiting Gurkha volunteers, marking the beginning of a very beautiful friendship with our oldest ally in Asia. And like we've just discussed, a British soldier recalled, I have never saw more steadfastness or bravery exhibited in my life. And all of these traits were put to very, very good use as the new Gurkha regiments came in clutch to help suppress uprisings in India as and when they popped up. But while their value was excruciatingly clear for all of the company's enemies, it was in 1857 when they really proved both their loyalty and their bravery. The Indians kicked off in such a big way that it wasn't just an Indian rebellion, it was the Indian rebellion. For a year and a half, the Gurkhas put the revolting Sepoys and Mughals in their fucking place. Under a British flag. In one of their finest hours, they held Hindu Rao's house, a key position, for 3 months alongside the 60th Rifles, suffering 327 casualties out of 490 men. And all but one of their 9 British officers failed to get out unscathed. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the East India Company dissolved, and the ever-loyal Gurkhas continued to fight with us, transferring to the British Indian Army. From that point onwards, the Gurkhas were among the first to be sent out whenever there were problems on the northwest frontier or the subcontinent throughout the rest of the colonial era. Most importantly, throughout the Second Afghan War. But how were the ranks topped up over time? How were the standards maintained so that the Gurkha regiments remained as tough as they were when we first met them? Well, the selection process is extremely rigorous and extremely competitive. The applicants are all young Nepalese men between the ages of 17 and 21, mostly made up of poor hill farmers who live in areas so remote that many of them have to walk hundreds of miles to the recruiting centres. Of course, living in such conditions means that a place in the British Army is a huge change in fortunes, not just for the recruit, but for his entire family. So there is a lot of pressure on Nepalese boys to get in. And every year, 28,000 young Gurkha men all apply and compete for only 200 places. We only take the very best of the best, which is somewhat difficult to do fairly because of a culture of corruption where money can get one ahead in everything. Therefore, test questions have to be constantly changed and kept under strict lock and key to prevent them from just being immediately sold off. British officers are prominent everywhere to reassure potential recruits that there will be no provisions made based on caste or ethnicity. And all results are rigorously double and triple checked at every single stage of the selection process. The potential recruits are given medical and physical tests, they are tested on maths and English, and they are interviewed by officers. All of the standard stuff. But the fitness test, well, that's where shit gets real. Gurkha recruits need to be able to do 75 bench jumps in just 1 minute and 70 sit-ups in 2 minutes. But the most infamous test is the Dankula race, a 5-mile run up the steep Himalayan foothills while carrying a 25-kilogram bag of sand on their backs with nothing but a head strap. And they have to do it in under 55 minutes. Even by Gurkha standards, the Dankula race is extremely hard because most of the recruits, while hard as nails, are relatively softened by living in cities. But back in the day, that sort of run was just a daily activity for them. Pass or fail, the end of selection is a very emotional moment, with the whole lives of many hanging on that single moment. If they get in, it is the greatest moment of their lives. If they don't, then they try again the following year if they are under 21 and they can afford the journey to the recruiting centre again. The successful recruits waste no time. They get a quick phone call home to tell their families the good news, and they are immediately issued with their new kit. They keep none of their own possessions, and then they are taught a little bit of drill, and then they swear allegiance to the king. Despite this, however, the Gurkhas are still Nepalese citizens who are essentially on contract. But don't call them mercenaries. They are still intensely loyal, and they take their oaths to the crown very, very seriously. The next day, the recruits are brought to the UK and they face their hardest test, being brutalised by our shitty weather.
So this is my 15 years in UK, and I still find it cold. I just got back from Nepal as well, and I think I'm shivering right now as well.
Even after 15 years, they just don't get used to the cold. The recruits are then taken around the country to learn more of the English language and culture through immersion, such as this trip to Whitby for fish and chips, their first ever view of the sea, and a chat with the locals. Gurkhas always get on really, really well with the public here, owing to them being extremely nice, polite to a fault, as well as having good banter. The next 9 months see the Gurkha recruits training at Catterick Garrison in Yorkshire, where in addition to their military training, their language skills are sharpened up and they're taught about our customs and regimental culture. By the way, English is usually a Gurkha's third or even fourth language. They also speak Nepalese, obviously, but their mother tongues tend to be one of the very, very many tribal languages from Nepal. And they often also know Hindi. And not only is this training much, much longer than that of the regular British Army, but it is also a lot harder. Even as recruits, Gurkhas operate on another level. So much so that after one recruit recovered from a broken leg, he had to finish his training with the Coldstream Guards. And he absolutely fucking mogged them all. The Gurkhas consistently lead in army shooting competitions and they always win the Trail Walker race, a 100-kilometre charity trek in the South Downs that is run by the Gurkha Welfare Trust and the Queen's Gurkha Signals. The fastest British team tends to get through it in about 12 or 13 hours, while the Gurkhas can do it in 8.5. That's fucking obscene. After passing out, the new Gurkhas join their regiment, taking roles as infantrymen, sappers, signallers, drivers, chefs, clerks, etc., etc., but most importantly, they are issued with their kukri, the weapon that the Gurkhas used all the way back in the first invasion of Kathmandu. The Gurkhas have curved knives. Curved knives. According to legend, it was first given to them by Guru Gorakhnath himself. Other than the Gurkhas' strength and fearlessness, the kukri is a big part of why they wreaked so much havoc when we first met them. It is extremely hard to parry a kukri with swords because they're curved and they just bend right round the guard. And it facilitates a wrist technique that makes it really effective to wield. And it is so sharp that it can take a man's head off with a single stroke. The blade is 16 to 18 inches of tempered steel with a notch at the top to prevent blood from touching the handle, which is often made of wood or buffalo horn. It's kept in a scabbard made of wood and leather, which also contains two smaller knives. One, the chakmak, is blunt and it's used to light fires with a flint. And the karda is a sharp general purpose knife that is mainly used for skinning animals, not people, because that's a war crime. Though there was one incident which I'll get into later. The big blade itself is used for basically everything, including combat, hacking through jungles, cooking, and animal sacrifice, which is something that the Gurkhas do. There is also another type of kukri that is used just for the latter, but it's a little bit longer and it can cut a goat's head clean off. But you can be sure that the Gurkhas know how to use it. Damn near all of them are really, really good butchers and have a reputation for actually being able to make really good food. Despite being from the subcontinent, those dishes have structure and order to them. I hereby designate them non-slop. But as cool as the kukri is, there is something about it that really disappoints me. You see, before starting the research for this video, the only thing that I knew about the Gurkhas was something that I read on Today I Learned. It turns out that the rule about Gurkhas having to draw blood every single time they draw their kukri to the point of having to cut themselves after cleaning it is a myth. It's not real. They don't actually do that. My day is fucking ruined. I can't believe that Reddit would lie to me. Despite being mountain framing, sadly the Gurkhas don't actually do the Chris knife ritual. But they are more than edgy and badass enough, with their motto being, better to die than be a coward. Also, their battle cry is Ayo Gorkale, which translates into the Gurkhas are here. A battle cry that can fill you with either hope or terror, depending on which side you're on. I've just realised that their battle cry is Ayo! Ayo Gorkale! While they're running around beheading people. Ayo! Bang! That's, for some reason, that makes it even more terrifying. As high as the standards for Gurkhas are, the expectations for their officers are also pretty fucking nuts. Despite usually being British, they must be able to meet the Gurkhas under their command on their level, which means speaking fluent Nepalese and understanding all of the Gurkhas' cultural nuances. Oh, and the officers are also built different. For example, Colonel Peter Jones distinguished himself in the 1943 Battle of Enfidaville in Tunisia by supporting the Gurkhas' charge with their kukris. In doing so, Jones took a hit to the neck, but still rallied his men and covered the charge by grabbing a Bren gun and knocking out a machine gun post. Despite being wounded, he still joined the ensuing melee, taking wounds to the thighs and his eye, refusing any first aid to continue fighting with his men, and he utterly refused to pass out until the position was captured and held. Jones's heroism earned him a good rest on a stretcher and an immediate Distinguished Service Order. Also, no, you did not mishear me earlier. The Gurkhas charged a machine gun nest with knives. And they still won. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. That was World War II. What about World War I? Well, with the outbreak of the Great War, the Gurkhas went intercontinental, fighting in Europe for the very first time. The Nepalese were even such bros that they put their entire army at Britain's disposal. And good lord, did they outdo themselves. As General Sir James Wilcox put it, Gurkhas were exposed to every form of terror, and they could reply only with their valour and the rifles and the 2 machine guns per battalion with which they were armed. And yet, they did it. The Gurkhas' valour was on such another level that they were among the first in and last out at Gallipoli. And they were the only troops to secure their objective and push back the Turks. At the Battle of Sari Bair, the Gurkhas managed to reach and hold the crest line, Gurkha Bluff, with relatively few casualties. While the Turks were distracted by an artillery bombardment, a double company from the 1st Battalion of the 6th Gurkha Rifles snuck over from the beach, climbed the cliffs and rushed the trenches. Then their machine gun section was brought forward to cover the 2nd, 3rd and 4th double companies as they went up and over in waves. The fact that they had managed to pull this off made a hell of an impression on Field Marshal Sir William Slim, who said, "I first met the 6th Gurkha Rifles in 1915 in Gallipoli. There, I was so struck by their bearing in one of the most desperate battles in history that I resolved, should the opportunity come, to try and serve with them. 4 years later it came, and I spent many of the happiest and, from a military point of view, the most valuable years of my life in the regiment." The Gurkhas were less lucky, but by no means less brave, at the Battle of Loos in Flanders, where a battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles fought literally to the last. Over the course of the whole war, the Gurkhas conducted themselves so heroically that they won almost 2,000 awards for gallantry and heroism. They didn't really get a break in the interwar period as they were busy kicking arse in the 3rd Anglo-Afghan War. Notably, with air support from the RAF, they got to storm the fort at Spin Baldak in what is believed to be the last use of scaling ladders in British history. However, while the Gurkhas did a great job, I'm sure that you can guess what the outcome of that war was. On the 21st of December 1923, the Gurkhas got a nice break as envoys from Britain and Nepal met at the Lion's Palace in Kathmandu to sign the Anglo-Nepal Treaty of Perpetual Peace and Friendship. Drafted out of gratitude for Nepal's assistance in World War I, it was a formal recognition of Nepal's sovereignty and independence, which cemented our partnership, and also warded off China from getting any funny ideas. But the strength of this partnership was put to the test sooner than anyone would have liked, because in the opening months of World War II, it was said that Britain stood alone. But this is not quite true. In 1940, after France fell, Nepal answered the call. When Britain requested additional Gurkha battalions, the Nepalese Prime Minister replied, "Does a friend desert a friend in time of need? If you win, we win with you. If you lose, we lose with you." And once again, we got the entire Nepalese army. The Nepalese were such fucking bros that they even donated loads of money for weapons, equipment and fighter planes that flew in the Battle of Britain. And aid was also given to the Lord Mayor of London to fund relief during the Blitz. Meanwhile, the Gurkhas were off fighting all over the place. They were there for the liberation of Italy with the 1st Battalion of the 9th Gurkha Rifles, making it all the way to the monastery during the Battle of Monte Cassino, before running out of supplies and having to abandon it 9 days later. The Gurkhas also scared the ever-loving shit out of the Japanese in Burma. You know how we make all those jokes about the trees speaking Vietnamese? Well, that's probably how the Japanese felt while getting bushwhacked by the Gurkhas. The Japanese were very, very scared of them, believing them to be human devils, especially when they would be bearing down on them in the jungle while screaming, "Ayo, Gurkhale!" It was like, they would just be going through the jungle, some little 5-foot man would just pop out of a bush and go, "Ayo!" and just behead like 5 Japanese soldiers before the guy finally get killed. Like, no wonder they were fucking terrified. In 1945, one such cheeky little chappie was Lakhiman Gurung, who was in a trench with 2 of his comrades when 200 Japanese soldiers attacked. It wasn't long before Gurung's comrades were wounded and he had to fight back alone. Being a Gurkha and therefore being completely fucking mental, he picked up and lobbed back 2 grenades that were thrown into the trench. But because the Japanese apparently took comedy classes, the 3rd grenade exploded in Gurung's hand, blowing off most of his fingers and wounding his face, chest and his right leg. However, he continued to single-handedly fight off Japanese soldiers by firing his rifle left-handed while screaming, "Come and fight a Gurkha." For this, he earned a Victoria Cross, and the guy actually lived until he was 92. After the war, the empire was dismantled and sold up the fucking river. So the partition of India took place in 1947. We don't have time to get into that fucking mess, but the key point here is that once everything was divided up, we kept 4 of the Gurkha regiments. The 7th Duke of Edinburgh's own Gurkha Rifles, the 10th Princess Mary's own Gurkha Rifles, the 2nd King Edward VII's own Gurkha Rifles, also known as the Sirmuir Rifles, and the 6th Queen Elizabeth's own Gurkha Rifles. In subsequent years, a few other units were formed, including the Gurkha Engineers and the Gurkha Signals. And as part of a tripartite agreement between Britain, India and Nepal, the Gurkhas were recognised as regulars in all 3 armed forces. The Indians got almost all of the rest of the Gurkhas, with the Singaporeans getting a unit for riot control and counter-terrorism. And Brunei's royal family got some for a personal guard as well. By the way, the Indian Gurkhas, I mean, they suck compared to ours. I mean, they're still badass as fuck because they're Gurkhas, but the Indians, they can't quite channel and hone that raw power quite like British training and discipline can. With the new status quo in place, our remaining Gurkha regiment spent the next 12 years killing communists in the Malayan jungle. But sadly, the needs of the army changed over the course of the 20th century, and the Gurkhas' numbers were reduced, until the 4 regiments were merged into the Royal Gurkha Rifles in 1994. In lieu of regimental colours, they still use a ceremonial staff named the Queen's Truncheon that was awarded to the Sirmur Regiment by Queen Victoria herself all the way back in 1863 for notable service in the 1857 Siege of Delhi. In 1997, another big change was made in the wake of British territory just being fucked away for absolutely no reason, as the Gurkhas' headquarters was moved from Hong Kong to the UK, which was commemorated by the erection of a memorial in Whitehall. Only 3,600 Gurkhas serve in the British Army today, making up 2 battalions, one in Shorncliffe and one in Brunei. You see, the Gurkhas have always excelled in jungle warfare, having done so well in Malaya and Borneo that they now train our guys in Brunei. There are also 2 Spec Ops companies serving in the Ranger Regiment. It's a shame that the Gurkhas have been diminished like this because they were truly, truly legendary. Over the course of the 2 world wars, the Gurkhas won 13 Victoria Crosses, with another 13 going to their British officers. The lucky winner of the first Victoria Cross was Kulbir Thapa, who earned it after his very first time under fire because those little guys just come out fucking swinging. And the Gurkhas have maintained that sort of energy to the present day, because since the unnecessary wars, they have caused carnage absolutely everywhere that they have been needed, from Kosovo to Bosnia, even as far afield as the Falklands. What's very, very funny about the Falklands is that the RGs actually knew about the Gurkhas and they were fucking petrified of them, to the point that they ran away from them, thinking that the Gurkhas were going to behead them and then eat them. I mean, the former part might have been true, but the Gurkhas were actually very offended about that. But not because of the implicit racism, the Gurkhas were actually offended by the cowardice. The Gurkhas were really, really pissed off because the RGs ran. We came all the way here for a fucking fight, get fucking back here. Ew! I don't know why. I think the fact that the war cry is so fucking funny makes it even more fucking terrifying. But also, in the new millennium, you can be absolutely sure that the Gurkhas were there to take just one more crack at Afghanistan. But, of course, the current state of the army has done absolutely nothing to diminish the heroics of the Gurkhas. In 2010, Acting Sergeant Diprasad Poon, Poon by name, Poon by nature, was guarding a checkpoint roof all by himself, when he found himself suddenly surrounded by 30 Taliban insurgents, all armed with RPGs and AKs. Believing that he was going to die anyway, Poon said, "Fuck it, we ball," and decided to take as many Taliban insurgents as he could along with him. So, for almost an hour, Poon fought tooth and nail, expending 400 rounds of ammunition, 17 grenades, and even a claymore mine that he just activated and fucking threw at them. Eventually, his SA-80 jammed because it's a dogshit gun that literally no one likes, but anyway, when a Taliban soldier climbed up onto the roof, Poon beat the absolute shit out of him with a machine gun tripod and then knocked him off of the roof. The scrap ended with all 30 insurgents dead, and Poon earning a conspicuous gallantry cross. And such valour runs in the family because his grandfather actually earned a Victoria Cross for a similar feat in World War II. And speaking of Afghanistan, you probably know about the case from 2011 where a Taliban commander had just been taken out, but his body needed to be retrieved to verify the kill with DNA evidence. So the Gurkha who was given the order just went, aye, and then drew his kukri and then strolled back with the severed head, in a bag. Despite that being a very badass way of carrying out his orders, he was investigated to see if this action was a war crime, with a court-martial very much on the table. You see, Muslims aren't very happy with being buried without intact bodies, and mutilating corpses isn't exactly very sporting. And if you want a more notable example of this controversy, Google canoeing. Or maybe don't. But anyway, fortunately, our boy was later cleared when it came out that the circumstances behind the decapitation weren't so clear-cut. While out on the retrieval mission, he came under very heavy fire. He ran out of ammunition and he didn't have time to reload, and also bodies are very, very heavy. So, in the heat of the moment, and to make sure he could still carry out his orders, with no other options, he just took the head and then he hauled arse out of there. Even when off duty, the Gurkhas are still fucking mental. We're going to give the Indian Army Gurkhas their due for a moment because Bishnu Shrestha is an absolute chad. One day, he made the mistake of travelling on a train in India, which was held up by 40 robbers. Like all of his other fellow passengers, he just kept his head down lest any harm should come to anyone else. But when the robbers' attentions turned to a woman with lecherous intent, all bets were off. Shrestha drew his kukri because the Gurkhas always have that thing on them and immediately killed 3 of the robbers. And he injured a further 8 more, prompting the rest of them to run for their lives. Shrestha himself only suffered an injury to his arm from which he made a full recovery. A single Gurkha fought 40 men and fucking won. To date, over 19,000 Gurkhas have died in His Majesty's service. And for some perspective on the cost of the biggest waste of life in human history, 6,000 of these losses occurred in World War I and 9,000 in World War II. And the total casualties were 20,000 and 32,000 respectively. Reflecting on the bravery and sacrifice of the Gurkhas, Sir Ralph Turner, a former Gurkha officer who served with them in World War I, wrote this. My thoughts return to you who were my comrades, the stubborn and indomitable peasants of Nepal. Once more, I hear the laughter with which you greeted every hardship. Once more, I see you in your bivouacs or about your campfires, on forced marches or in the trenches, now shivering with wet and cold, now scorched by a pitiless and burning sun. Uncomplaining, you endure hunger and thirst and wounds, and at the last, your unwavering lines disappear into the smoke and wrath of battle. Bravest of the brave, most generous of the generous, never had a country more faithful friends than you. However, it would be nice if the powers that be here could actually fucking act like it. Unfortunately, despite the Gurkhas getting the same pay and conditions as regular soldiers, there are irregularities in the pension fund. There was much outrage when it came out that Gurkha veterans only received £37 a month compared to the £800 of British soldiers, which was so little that many retired Gurkhas ended up going on to work in private security to make ends meet, often in Hong Kong. Naturally, protests ensued and the Gurkhas are so extra that the most prominent form of protest is hunger strikes, usually for periods of 14 days. The issue was partially resolved in 2007 when those who served after the 1st of July 1997 were allowed to transfer to the British Armed Forces pension scheme. But those who retired before then are still left in the lurch because the pre-1997 Gurkha pensions are based on Indian Army rates. Sadly, this dispute is still ongoing and it's looking like the hunger strikes will continue until the pensions improve. And since these guys are hard as nails and don't do anything in half measures, they outright state that they are willing to fucking die if that's what it takes. It shouldn't have come to that, but goddamn, I do respect the hell out of it. The Gurkhas fought, killed, were wounded, and died for us in every war that we've been involved in for over 2 centuries now. Giving them their proper pensions is the least that we can do. They deserve it for their loyalty to be reciprocated. But the pensions aren't just controversial among the Gurkhas. The native British were absolutely outraged when this came to light because the Gurkhas are very, very popular among the British public, and especially among the British Armed Forces. Not just because of how badass and loyal they are, but because they're just incredibly nice. As of September, there are still no plans to implement pension parity. Since the British government has a long history of betrayal, see also the selling out of Poland and the betrayal of the Cossacks, the powers that be say that the pensions are fair because 3 judicial reviews, including one to the ECHR, said so. They also say that the pensions are fine because they still provide, quote, a good income for our Gurkha veterans living in Nepal. Now, that's all well and good, but the problem is that there are a lot of broke Gurkha veterans here who can't afford to go back to Nepal. Which brings us to another sore point among the retired Gurkhas. Since Nepal is not in the Commonwealth, the Gurkhas are not British subjects, so allowing them to settle here was resisted by the government because of the stress that 36,000 veterans would put on immigration and social services. Gordon Brown also claimed that we couldn't afford to look after them. It's like, all of this in hindsight's just fucking funny now, isn't it? Which, I mean, it's just quaint. It's just quaint, isn't it? I really do miss the days when the government would come out and say, this'll hurt social services. This'll cost way too much money. Does anybody remember the days when 36,000 was considered too many? I remember those days. I miss those fucking days. And also, the Commonwealth argument just really pisses me off, and I'm just going to move on from that. Because if we start discussing immigration from the subcontinent, my channel's going to get a fucking strike. Only those veterans who had retired after 1997 when the Gurkha HQ was moved here were allowed to settle, which sparked a big campaign prominently supported by Joanna Lumley, whose father's life had actually been saved by a Gurkha in a Victoria Cross Earning Act. And in May of 2009, they got an absolutely fabulous result. All 36,000 retired Gurkhas were allowed to settle with their families. But don't get white-pilled just yet. This was not the government winding its neck in and deciding to do the right thing. It was just defeated in a Commons vote. And look, I know that we all have our opinions on immigration, right? But if it was to be anyone, look at their track record of loyalty. Credit where it's due. But just because they can doesn't mean they should, because there is another angle to this debate, and while I am personally Starship Troopers pilled and inclined to grant the Gurkhas citizenship because they do kind of deserve to settle here, I don't actually think that they should though. Of course, there are the standard debates about integration, which, considering how wholesome and steeped in British customs and culture the Gurkhas are, they do take their oath to the king very, very seriously. If anyone could integrate, it's them. If it was just the veterans themselves, settling here and starting families, marrying into the tribe and all that. But bringing over their families is a whole other issue because that's how enclaves form. And 3 generations later, look, it's a no. Right? So I know that's a bit of a heartless take, but we do have to remain ideologically consistent here. That said, however, there is also a less selfish argument to be made in what I believe to be the Gurkhas' best interest, because, to be honest, I think that the Gurkhas settling here would do a disservice to both them and Nepal. A bit of brain drain, if you will. And as a Gurkha veteran turned writer named Tin Gurung pointed out, this brain drain may actually be part of the reason why Nepal never rebelled again after the Anglo-Nepalese War, since we had all of their top guys. And if all of the good Gurkha stock is settled and having kids here, where will we get more Gurkhas? And who would the Nepalese look to form a productive elite? Look at what happened to the Fremen after Arrakis was terraformed. After just a handful of generations, they lost everything that made them badass. Don't get me wrong, we should still help improve conditions in Nepal, but the thin mountain air and the rugged terrain is clearly good for you. Besides, it's shit here, and Nepal's fucking gorgeous. You know how I feel about the importance of being attached to one's homeland, and the Gurkhas more than deserve to live in their own as heroes. And we should help them to do so. If you're still not convinced, money talks, and a British Army pension, a full one, would go a lot further in Nepal than here. Though, again, that pension should be a lot higher. Not just because the Gurkhas earned it, but because they should be able to return home as gentry, flush with the spoils of glorious service, able to spend their retirements developing and improving Nepal with more active support from us. A lot of Gurkhas already send money home while in the service anyway, so they're clearly community-minded enough to do what it takes to lift their families and communities out of poverty. After all that Nepal and the Gurkhas have done for us, they deserve a reciprocal special relationship with us. But a proper one. Unfortunately, however, my country is a joke run by ungrateful, spiteful mutants who are too busy showering their own clients in cash to repay debts to our real allies. Take the pension money out of the fucking aid budget or something. If there's one country that actually deserves it, it's Nepal, especially with all of the natural disasters that they keep having, where, again, the Gurkhas come in clutch every single time. They were never willing to leave a man behind and would always put themselves in unbelievable danger to rescue wounded comrades, even if they themselves were injured. They often crawled if they had to. The fact that this is even the case in retirement speaks volumes. I know that I'm basically just shamelessly fanboying at this point, but come on, the Gurkhas are extremely fucking cool and they deserve a lot of props for all of the feats of bravery, strength and absolute insanity that they have pulled off over the years. As Field Marshal Slim Montgomery said in 1970, by their courage and endurance, they have made a magnificent contribution to the success of British arms. Their good comradeship has always been a source of strength to our own soldiers. We believe that everyone in this country owes them a great debt for their loyal and devoted service in numerous campaigns over many years. The Gurkhas are so badass that there are simply just too many individual stories to put in one video. Also, everybody keep an eye on the comments underneath this video because there's probably going to be a lot of current serving and ex-squaddies in there and they are going to have some fucking stories about the Gurkhas. Many will surely feature a recurring motif of Gurkhas relentlessly running in the open, through enemy fire, bearing down on an overwhelming number of enemies until they can wreak absolute carnage with their kukris, not giving a single fuck about injuries until they'd finished the fight. You'll never find braver or more ferocious warriors. After all, in the words of Field Marshal Sam Manekshaw, if a man says he's not afraid of dying, he's either lying or he is a Gurkha.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.